Thank you, Marty. In my 42-year career working for the National Conference of State Legislatures, I have known literally thousands of legislators across the United States. I maintain my own personal top 10 list that includes both Democrats and Republicans on that list. Now, there are lots of reasons for why different people get included in that top 10, but the one common thing about all of them is that they have a reverence for representative democracy, for the institution of the legislature. They support and defend the institution, and they attempt to make it stronger. Our speaker today, David Skaggs, is in my top 10. He's been an advocate and defender of the state legislature, the Congress, and the Constitution throughout his career. He's demonstrated remarkable commitment to civility, bipartisanship, and governmental ethics while both in and out of public office. Now, most of you are familiar with the outlines of David's career. Many of you have known him for years and years. As we've been here today, so many people have come up to greet him. So I probably don't need to tell you about his education at Wesleyan University, his attendance at and graduation from Yale Law School, his Marine Corps service that includes active duty in Vietnam, retiring as a major in the Marine Corps. I don't need to tell you about his 18 years of service in the Colorado State Legislature and the Congress combined. And you know about his remarkable continued commitment to public service after he voluntarily stepped down from Congress in 1999. Among many other contributions, he has led an effort to challenge the constitutionality of Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR. And if David doesn't get to this in his prepared remarks, I hope somebody will ask him a question about where that stands. So, but there are a couple of things you probably don't know about him. One of them is that he is passionate about singing. He's been a member of church choirs throughout his life, and for nearly 40 years has sung in the choir of First Congregational United Church of Christ in Boulder. A wonderful contribution that those of us in First Congregational Church get to enjoy every Sunday. But one of the things I like best about David is that he's an old-fashioned guy in the best sense of the word. He's a gentleman who would never be seen wearing a hat indoors. And he always wears a tie to church, usually his trademark bow tie. And as a public speaker, I have never, ever known him to use PowerPoint. So it's my pleasure to give you David Skaggs' Songs PowerPoint.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, and great to be with you and see so many old friends. My wife, Laura, would be on my case in a second if I didn't recognize Nancy Geyer and put in a pitch for the opening of the Museum of Boulder, May 19th. I trust you've been advancing this cause, Nancy. So, someone asked if I had a lot of jokes to tell, but the subject really doesn't lend itself to a lot of one-liners, so I hope you'll bear with me with a relatively sober presentation about the state of politics these days. Actually, if I talked about Tabor, I would have a PowerPoint, Carl, so there you go. So my thesis for this talk runs roughly as follows. The founders established a constitutional system that requires compromise in order to make law, law being the policy guidelines for our society. Compromise depends on politicians seeking and keeping the kind of trust that's necessary to work out compromises. That trust, in turn, depends upon some fundamental personal relationships between politicians that can engender that trust only if those relationships are conducted with respect and civility. And that means finding and making time to get to know political opponents as colleagues rather than as enemies. Unfortunately, after 2 generations really of neglecting civic education in this country, most of our citizens no longer appreciate and insist upon, rather than denigrating, compromising with the other side. And their tribal voting behavior ensues. We'll need to reverse these causes and effects if we hope to restore a functioning representative democracy that is our republic. Well, it's been quite a time for politics. Not so good so far in the search for the common good, which is what this is supposed to be about. And that may make it all the more timely for us to stop and take stock. I believe politics is and has to be about something more than ambition, personality, power, about more than economics. It seems to me the more important in the midst of an especially crude and profane political climate to remind ourselves of these things. I do that, and I hope you remind yourself that we've inherited a republic with an inherently moral core, a purpose and a core that we have some responsibility to care for. The founding generation, as children of the Enlightenment, certainly understood that the success of this experiment that we are living would depend upon enlightened citizens with small r Republican sensibility. That is a sense of public duty and responsibility. They grasped an Enlightenment view of democracy as evincing the proper natural freedom of the human spirit to shape its own future, the idea that government entails a reciprocal relationship between the people and the state. This has to do with our ideals and civic virtues, recognizing that our public life is rooted in and dependent upon a belief in, a dedication to a common good. With that in mind, how do we manage the necessary public business of a big and diverse country today? In his recent book, Tribe, Sebastian Unger points out that our species has depended on banding together, first in mutual defense for survival, and later in cooperation and commerce to have a better life. He draws the contrast with our modern life and its disintegration. Quote, "The beauty and tragedy of the modern world is that it eliminates many situations that require people to demonstrate a commitment to the collective good." We out here in the West, in particular, embrace the ideal of the pioneers and their rugged individualism. We forget that the settlers, collective defense, encircling the wagons, establishing communities to assure the rudiments of law and order, even setting up ditch companies that enabled agriculture to happen in this climate. For some time, our infatuation with the myth of rugged individualism has often morphed into a tolerance for what we might call ragged individualism, a pursuit of our separate and selfish interests without much concern for the effect on common interests and the common good. The inducements and incentives of the present age largely serve to pull us apart. The digitization of relationships so easily strips relationships of their humanity. And so courtesy has room to retreat, letting the crude and vulgar, or at least the impersonal, become more prevalent. Whatever may be going on to push us toward lowered norms and an erosion of a shared commitment to the common good, it is of our own making. To change that is, to start, a matter of recognizing the problem and accepting some responsibility not blaming some vague force over which we have no control. And at least this incorrigible optimist wants to believe this is so. We have been, we are in the democracy business. It's a demanding business, and one with an inspired past, and I hope and pray a promising future. Unlike the recent run-up in the Dow, how's it doing today, by the way? What a blessing. Unlike the recent run-up in the Dow, democracy futures are down. Around the world, the flowering of democracy we saw at the end of the Cold War has been stunted and is in retreat in far too many places. Here at home, what was once a pretty abstract notion that our democracy could be fragile has taken on a new reality and even some urgency. We've all made some pretty large investments in this democracy business. Why is business down? What's going on? What can we do about it? Well, before getting to that, let's remember, I hope, why we care. I think our love of democracy and our commitment to it comes from some simple, yet still profound first principles. It is those Enlightenment ideas and ideals that Jefferson captured in the Declaration and that Madison and the founders sought to implement in the Constitution. We are all equals before the law. We believe in the dignity of the individual. The people are sovereign. A government's just powers comes from the consent of the governed. Individuals acting through the expected wisdom of their representatives can divine and preserve a republic. And beyond our individual pursuits, we are bound together in a great civic enterprise grounded in a free people. Back in the day when the Democrats were in the majority in the House, I often had the privilege of being asked to chair debate. It was really a kick to stand there at the podium, gavel in hand, and try to manage the proceedings of the People's House. As part of that experience, I would sometimes indulge in imagining the spirits of Jefferson and Madison lurking in the back of the House chamber, sort of taking stock of their children. The wisdom and the prescience of the founders never fails to astound, humble, and inspire me. So this afternoon, I'm going to draw on the writings of Madison and Hamilton in particular to frame comments that I hope may be able to connect a few dots between the 18th and the 21st centuries. From your civics and history classes, I know you will recall the words of the Federalist Papers. If only we still taught this material, but I'll have a word about that more in the future. As our Constitution seems destined to undergo yet another test of relevance and resilience, let's go back and see how the experiment got started. Here's a bit of how Madison, Hamilton, and Jay explained to their fellow citizens what they had proposed for the new nation at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Hamilton went first, posing a fundamental question. Was there sufficient wisdom, maturity, and common purpose in the nation for this new civic structure to be able to succeed? To this not rhetorical question, he addressed Federalist One, and I quote, and the poignance of this with regard to current times is amazing. Quote, "It seems to me to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice. A wrong election may in this view deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good," unquote. It fell to Madison in Federalist 10 to set out the core rationale for representative democracy. what he explained as the essence of a republican form of government and its inherent virtue. Listen to how Madison might speak to the Congress of today. Quote, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties. A republic, a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, promises the cure for what we are seeking. The delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. The effect is to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations." Sounds like your Congress today, right? So the Congress is charged with an awesome responsibility to be that chosen body of citizens that Madison described so powerfully. These words sound almost naive to our ears today. They remind us that a legislature is of necessity in the business of compromise, of sorting through competing interests, of considering others' views, all in order to arrive, God willing, at some approximation of the common good. I spent a day at the Capitol recently, again observing the business of our legislature. It was, in all its messiness and occasional rancor, a reminder of how we govern ourselves, or are supposed to, by working out our differences through debate and deliberation and give and take. Making deals, as offensive to some as that may sound, depends on civic virtue and some faith in each other's goodwill, subordinating individual positions to something greater. I would like to think that the collective judgment that can and does emerge from that work is the product of the better angels Lincoln invoked in his first inaugural, and not the human failings Madison acknowledged in Federalist 51, reflecting a wisdom instead that best discerns the true interest of the country. This business of compromise is at the heart of representative democracy. It obviously depends on some mutual respect among and between those in office, and even among and from those who choose those in office. Such respectfulness necessarily assumes a civic virtue, civility, treating one another decently on the individual level and with comity at the institutional level. Let me digress just for a minute. As many of us in Congress saw the fabric of respect and civility unraveling in the 1990s, we tried to understand and get at its root cause. That was the gradual erosion of personal relationships among and between Republicans and Democrats. There were many contributing factors to this partisan disaffection, but large among them was simply not spending time together. We made a vain effort to reverse some of the erosion of relationships with the House bipartisan retreats, which some of you may remember. We started in 1997, and sadly they ended in 2003. The simple idea, which I think is still pertinent, was to carve out some time and safe space for members of Congress and their families to get to know one another simply as fellow human beings. Some people somewhat derisively called them the civility retreats. Whatever the label, we tried to prevent or at least slow the looming slide into partisan tribalism. But back to the business at hand. As much as the delegates at Philadelphia understood the need for a strong central government, they remained skeptical of power and its potential for abuse. And so they devised an architecture that, to the extent possible, would prevent and be self-correcting of abuses. We are familiar, I think all of us, with the core principles of checks and balances and separation of powers. An absolutely brilliant solution, but one we sometimes forget was intended to make it hard to abuse power by making it hard to make law. We remain constitutionally fraught by this deliberate inefficiency, and to the extent that we forget about it, we are open prey to the panderers of false efficiencies. Let's make government work more like a business. So again, the words of Madison in Federalist 51, after he noted that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Quote, "To what expedient then shall we finally resort? The only answer that can be given is by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places, giving to those who administer each department, think executive, judicial, legislative, each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others." And the famous line, quote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." Well, that's, the essence of our balance and separation of powers doctrine. For resolving disputes, we sometimes forget that politics is the alternative to violence. Politics and the art of compromise requires goodwill, understanding the needs of others, consideration of the greater good, and some trust. These civic virtues and civic necessities are the secular political embodiment of moral qualities. They do not coexist well with selfishness, so perhaps the golden rule lurks unannounced in the Constitution. The final bulwark devised against the allure of power and its excesses was to be, and still is, the judiciary. There had to be a final arbiter of constitutional limits in a government of strong yet limited powers. The answer was a system of independent review by judges insulated insofar as possible from the political winds of the day. In Federalist 78, Hamilton counseled his fellow citizens, quote, "The complete independence of the courts of justice is particularly essential. Without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing," unquote. As important as that is, it's not exactly on topic for today. Anyway, I hope it's been okay to borrow so heavily from those who speak to us from the grave. They seem to me to speak with special gravity and eloquence to us today. The founders said so much to which those who practice politics these days might well pay attention. Our politics reflect our people. If they do not understand the basics of US government, they can't be expected to participate thoughtfully in electing their leaders. It is hard, impossible to run a system of representative democracy when the electors don't understand a system that depends on their informed participation and on the willingness of their representatives to compromise. This understanding seems in short supply these days, in part because we have not educated our citizens about it. And so there's little to counter a self-indulgent sort of politics which sees compromise as weakness. Rather, we must honor the strength that it takes to respect and accommodate the views of others. Understanding the complexities of government is not something our citizens are born with. It all must be learned, and so it must be taught. In that light, the level of civic illiteracy in the country should trouble all of us who are in the democracy business. A tired but telling data point: more Americans can name the Three Stooges than one justice of the Supreme Court. Just 1 in 5 Americans is willing to trust the government in Washington, even most of the time, near the lowest level ever. The distrust isn't new. It's been with us for several presidencies and Congresses. This distrust sadly coincides with falling trust in society's other major institutions, whether it's business or religion, labor, the media, banks, whatever. Regrettably, many Americans have lost faith in their fellow citizens and their capacity for democracy. Just 1 in 3 Americans say that they have at least, quote, a good deal of confidence in the wisdom of the American people in making political decisions, unquote. That's down from 57% a decade ago and 2/3 back in 1997. An increasing number of our fellow citizens dislike or even loathe supporters of the other political party. Respect for the First Amendment rights of others is fraying. When you combine distrust for major institutions with distrust of our fellow citizens, the result is declining support for democracy itself. In a study a year ago, millennials said that they were losing faith in American democracy. Just 25% expressed confidence in our system. What can we do to heal the divides, overcome the polarization and distrust, and so have a chance to increase civic participation? How will people come to understand and respect that a necessity for compromise is built into our system? I believe that one very important potential remedy is to restore the nation's school and their core civic mission. For nearly 200 years, public education had a special responsibility equal in importance to preparation for higher ed or career, and that was, and still should be, to teach the knowledge and skills needed to be good citizens. Until the 1970s, roughly 3 distinct courses in civics and government were common in American high schools. Today, the norm is 1 semester government course, and it is often pretty dry stuff. Well-intentioned to boost student achievement in math and English have all too often had the effect of narrowing the curriculum in our schools, squeezing out time and resources for civics. An unintended consequence of the late No Child Left Behind Act has been to leave behind schools' mission to educate for participation in the democracy. That means a failure to teach several generations in this country now that a necessity for compromise is built into our constitutional scheme. The historic civic mission of our schools needs to be restored. The Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, a coalition of over 50 organizations, co-chaired by former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, and earlier by our own former Governor Roy Romer. Romer works to promote civic learning at the all-important state level. Carl Kurtz, during his time at NCSL, made important contributions to this effort, and I was proud to have been the original director of the campaign. This work to restore civic literacy is vital to the health and the future of our republic. It is, if you will, the venture capital of the democracy business. So let me retrace, I hope, the logical connections between the several propositions and arguments I've tried to advance. The mechanisms of governments of our democratic republic, a bicameral legislature, separation and balance of powers among its 3 branches, requires compromise. Compromise depends upon nurturing some trust among our representatives, and that requires that they know each other than as adversaries, that they have respect for each other's motives and objectives. For those conditions to exist, or at least have a chance, means that the voting population has to understand that these people are in the compromise business, that deal-making isn't just okay, it's essential. That understanding only comes when there's been enough civic groundwork done in the schools so Americans appreciate compromise, even honor it, rather than denigrate it. It isn't all that complicated, but it's not all that easy. I just pray that our country realizes what it needs to be doing if we want to right the ship of state and continue an experiment in self-government that's been pretty successful for the last 242 years. If it's not out of bounds, I'd like to put in a plug for a project Laura and I have underway at American University. It's called the Madison Prizes. Starting about a year from now, awards will be made to 1 Republican and 1 Democrat from either the House or Senate to recognize legislators who best exemplify the need for compromise and that Republican spirit that Madison expressed so well in Federalist 10. I have some handouts about this if anybody's interested. Anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to share some thoughts with you. Thank you. So Marty said that Bill would come up to give me the hook at exactly 1:16. So a couple of
Questions?
Don't you think one of the big dangers in our society right now is, quite bluntly, the internet and the ability of people to just watch and believe what they want to believe without looking at the facts, which the internet does and gets to be tribalized?
Well, and I would add to the internet sort of the disaggregation of media generally, the reduced role of newspapers and our understanding of what's going on in our civic life. I mean, all of those things, I think, lead, as I think your question suggests, to our cocooning of ourselves with those of like mind and not being pushed to consider what others have as their interests and needs.
David, in the pursuit of the common good, right here.
Gordon, yeah.
In the pursuit of the common good, that the dialogue that leads to compromise necessarily requires a respect for expertise. And it seems that examples of an unwillingness to give consideration to the Congressional Budget Office in formulating the policies regarding dismantling the Affordable Care Act and writing the tax bill, almost dismissing the value of the expertise of a bipartisan group who spent a lifetime doing that, seems to undermine the opportunity for compromise. I'd like to, if you'd say a few words about our disparagement of expertise.
Well, or, you know, a general growth of anti-electualism among our politicians and our politics. You know, in my mind, this started most powerfully back after change in control. I don't want this to become partisan, but this is necessarily so. Change in control of the House after the '94 elections, when Newt Gingrich came in as Speaker and, among other things, put the Office of Technology Policy, which was the source to the Congress of expertise in technical fields, put it out of business. Why in the world, in an ever more technologically challenged age, when so many political decisions depend upon an understanding of scientific and technical stuff, why you would disarm yourself that way makes no sense. And I agree with you. I think, you know, with unless you start to have facts, you can't have a common set of facts, and without a common set of facts, it's hard to reach some kind of compromise understanding of where policy should go.
So, thank you very much for your talk. Last fall, President Trump signed into law the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which had been approved by both the House and the Senate in the bipartisan level. And what this does is mandate women's full participation in all aspects related to peace and security, from homeland security to our foreign policy. And it's based on UN Resolution 1325. What's your thoughts on how this can best be implemented, and what difference do you see it making in our governance?
One of the joys of representing this part of Colorado in Congress was you always knew you would get challenged by questions that depended upon stuff you didn't know about. So thank you for that. I'm trained to deal with this on my feet, I hope. So I think I'll get to the second part of your second question more than your first, which is to say, and I guess I'm trying to revive my credentials as a male feminist. I think that the Congress in particular and our politics generally would be hugely advantaged by having more women in positions of power. And this, I pray, doesn't sound at all condescending. I mean it to sound deferential. But observing the problem-solving toolkits of women in political life that I have has been a great instruction on there being, you know, the Mars-Venus thing has some salience to it. And I'm still grieving over the death last week of Louise Slaughter, who was a classmate of mine, elected as I was to the House in 1986. Louise stuck around the Congress, was chair of the House Rules Committee for a while, the daughter of a Kentucky coal miner. Louise and I'm from Kentucky originally. We used to sing gospel hymns together on occasions after a drink or two. Anyway, Louise was, I think, exemplifies, the grit and yet the finesse that can be brought to public decision making by your gender.
David, as you pointed out, I'm the guy that gets to give you the hook. It's been pointed out that we're contemporaries and we even dress alike. Although I would suggest you trade your bow tie in for one of these. We've known each other for 40 years. We practiced law in town together against each other. We used to have breakfast together when you were in Congress, even though I was on the other side of the aisle, and we worked on international matters together. And in each of those instances, I can say you're a man of principle. And a man of principle in the way that Carl described. A man who believes in the institution, whether the institution is the courts, or the Congress, or the international order. And for that, we thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
And in your honor, this club, which along with Rotary International, is working to end polio. We will donate 100 doses of Polio Plus or polio vaccine to our Polio Plus campaign. We're, as we say, this close, and we really are this close. A few cases, and hopefully this year will be the last year, and 100 doses that we're donating in your name hopefully will make the difference.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.